Hey PCWorld fans, Adam here with Will, and there are new GPUs that have launched recently, the RTX 40 Super series. In this video specifically, we're going to be talking about the 4070 Super, and we're going to be covering gaming benchmarks, a little smattering of creative benchmarks. There's 4K, there's RT, a lot of stuff to get into, so I'm excited to dig into the numbers. Thanks for joining me, Will.
Thanks, Adam. I'm just really excited to know how super these video cards really are.
Well, we'll see. The numbers will bear fruit. Bigger bar better. So first up, let's go over the super specs. There are some things that are same and some things that are different. The things that are the same is that all these cards target 1440p gaming. They are all based off the AD104 die. They all have 12 gigs of GDDR6X VRAM, and they all come in at $600. It's not exactly true, but when the 4070 non-super launched, it was $600. These super variants are also coming in at $600.
And the bus width is the same on all these cards as well, right?
The bus width is the same at 192-bit. Yeah, correct. What is different is the CUDA core count. We're getting a jump from 5,888 to 7,162. If I double checked my math, which I didn't, I just looked it up on the internet, that's about a 22% increase in CUDA core count. So that is substantial.
It's a lot of CUDA cores. It makes me expect that we're going to see probably similar raster performance across the board, maybe a little improvement as the clock speeds go up just a smidge.
We'll see.
And probably some significant RT and compute task increases. So let's see how it goes.
And clock speeds did just come up just a little bit, as well as a TGP increase by about 20 watts. So from 200 watts to 220 watts. So some of the gains will be from CUDA core count, some will be from the increased power draw. But these cards specifically that I have on here, the non-super card that I have is the Asus Dual GeForce RTX 4070 OC edition. And on the super variant, I have the Nvidia Founders Edition, the reference.
It looks dainty in here amongst these other cards.
It's so cute and tiny.
Yeah.
But also because I'm I'm publishing this review a little bit later, I was able to get some testing in with another 4070 Super card. This one is a Gigabyte GeForce RTX 4070 Super Aero OC Edition, and then I will be comparing them to an ASRock Radeon RX 7800 XT Challenger OC Edition. On the Radeon side. So we got 4 GPUs to look at, and they all come in at different price points, obviously different sizes. We'll kind of talk about design stuff a little bit, but the 4070 non-super, this GPU launched at $600, but now you can actually get it for about $530. The Founders Edition, of course, comes in at straight $600, and the Aero actually has a little bit of a price premium up to $680. And the ASRock Challenger card comes in at $500. So
that's the street price for the Challenger now.
Yeah, as of right now, yeah, it's still fairly new. It just barely came out late last year, so the prices haven't dropped down too much, especially in relation to the super cards. AMD did some price changes on other cards. Once again, the 4070 non-super will stick around officially at $550, but like I said, this one I just looked at the prices yesterday before we recorded this, and you can get it for like $520, $530.
I'll be interested to see if that's a card that sticks around until stock is out of those chips and then they disappear quietly, or if it's going to be continued manufacturing indefinitely.
You know, I bet they're going to continue to manufacture it because, as we'll see in the charts when we get to them, there is definitely a place for this performance and for this price. I actually wouldn't be surprised if the price continues to drop and maybe settle around 500 for some of these variations. But obviously there are other non-super variants that are going to stick around and push closer to the super variant prices. So you have to do your own math when it comes to that and different designs. So now let's dig into the juicy stuff. We got the benchmarks. These are the charts. We got a little numbers to go through. We're going to kind of go through them. First up, we're going to start with a synthetic benchmark. This is a 3D Mark Speedway. It is a DX12 Ultimate benchmark, and it is really going to hammer these cards in ways that most of these games won't. But I mean, I think it is a good indication of how well suited these cards are for future use with things like ray tracing and whatnot. So
how the cards do with everything turned up all the way.
Exactly. So looking at the numbers, I mean, we're starting to see a little bit of a trend. The vanilla 4070 is definitely lagging behind the super variants, which is nice. We're also seeing that the Aero card has just a little bit of a bump over the Founders Edition card, but especially in these heavy-duty DX12 workloads, that 7800 XT is not really keeping up with even the non-super 4070. But that's just in one test. So now let's get over to actual gaming performance. First, we're going to start by going through at 1440p, then we'll do 4K, and then we'll do ray tracing and upscaling. So all the benchmarks in this first section for 1440p and 4K have no upscaling applied, no RT. We're just looking at pure raster here because for the most part, a lot of people are still just doing rasterized gaming.
It makes sense.
And it's important, yeah. So, but let's look at Cyberpunk 2077. This, even without RT, is still a pretty intensive game. And we're kind of seeing the same jump up that we did in 3D Mark Speedway from the non-super variant to the super variant. That is a healthy increase.
It's a healthy increase, but even the 4070 is a playable frame rate. If I'm playing a single player game, it's somewhere between 40 and 60 frames a second, I can cope with. I think you're at the minimum you want with this, though.
Yeah, and it definitely depends on your tolerance, for the games and the settings. This is just the way that I needed to kind of templatize and keep the benchmarks even across everything. Mm-hmm. And honestly, the other trend we're seeing here that we didn't see in Speedway is that 7800 XT was already well faster than that non-super card, and the super cards catch up. So in some ways, you would say that Nvidia was kind of maybe brought up this super variant to try to catch up with the performance of the 7800 XT, but that's not the case in all the games. We'll switch over to Returnal, and here Nvidia with the new super cards definitely has a little bit more of a lead over AMD. We kind of see that same jump from the non-super to the super variants, and once again, I think it just comes down to that healthy mixture of more CUDA cores, faster clocks, a little bit more power dumped into these cards. That we're seeing these healthy increases.
Yeah, this is not an insignificant frame increase.
Yeah. This you would feel this. Depending on whatever frame rate you're at, you're going to feel this increase. And next up is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. A little bit of an older title, but it doesn't get updated that much. We still see the same kind of situation here. The AMD card was already lagging behind, just slightly behind the non-super variant, and part of that is because some games prefer AMD, some games prefer Nvidia, some games are made with some sort of co-marketing budget with one company or the other. This game prefers Nvidia. Moving on to Rainbow Six Siege. This is the one that I like to have for esports players in here. I will note that even in the Ultra preset, it actually defaults to a 50% render scale, so this is not true 1440p, it's actually rendering half. But, I mean, with esports, you want more frames than bells and whistles. F122 is a game that also benefits from really high frame rates, and we're kind of seeing the same situation here.
It seems like it's the same increase across the board, somewhere between 15 and 25%, depending on the game and exactly what's being stressed.
Right? Yeah. And in some cases, AMD lags a little bit behind, depending on the game, but we also still see just a little bit of a bump using the AIB card over the Founders Edition card. We'll get more to that later.
Yeah.
And then I want to say this next benchmark that I have, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. I did the initial testing on the Founders Edition card, and when I came back to do the testing on the third-party card, unfortunately there was an update to the game that broke the benchmark for me, so I don't have those numbers. But just assume that it's kind of somewhere in there, in that same kind of place. And this benchmark reports averages, but also 1% lows. So
I love 1% lows.
1% lows are important because that kind of is the smoothness of the game.
Yeah, it's the average frame rate of the 1% slowest frames that it generates. So you get an idea. Like a big variance between the average frame rate and the 1% lows indicates that there's some micro stutter going on,
Exactly.
which is something that you maybe don't realize you detect, but you absolutely do detect in games.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And something that wasn't detected in the earlier benchmarks, because we were just looking at averages, is that if we look at the 1% lows on Nvidia versus AMD, we're seeing a wider discrepancy between the averages and the 1% lows on AMD.
The slower frames are slower on AMD than they are on Nvidia.
Yeah.
Of course, it's also a live service game. They're patching it constantly. Whatever happens today could be fixed in next week's patch. So,
True, but we still see the same thing when it comes to Watch Dogs, which this benchmark reports the 1% lows as well. And here we're still seeing that discrepancy between the averages and the 1% lows being wider on AMD generally than Nvidia. So something to note. Once again, I don't feel like this is a problem, but it seems like Nvidia just has performance a little bit tighter.
It's something they spend more time on, I think.
Exactly. So that's 1440p. I feel like all of these cards are well equated for 1440p. That's kind of what they aim at. Obviously, the 7800 XT is a little bit cheaper, but this 4070 non-super is coming down in price as well. So, 1440p is what these cards are suited for. And I feel like that they do really well when we're talking about pure rasterization. What do you think?
But if the opportunity here is, of course, that if you're willing to turn on upscaling, then you can maybe get some 4K perf out of this $500 to $600 card.
Right? Yeah, and I mean that's what people want, because maybe they want to step up to 4K, or maybe they want to treat, hey, how long is this card going to serve me in the future? Because 1440p requirements now are just going to get more intense going in the future.
Maybe they want to run a long HDMI cable into their living room, plug it in the TV.
Maybe.
Who knows?
Yeah, who knows? So one of the good ways to test it is actually I did go back and test these cards at 4K. Once again, not to necessarily say you're going to play them at 4K, but this is maybe a good indication of how these cards will handle 1440p in the future.
Yeah.
Or more, maybe 1440p with different kind of bells and whistles. So coming back through the stack, though, we see the same story unfold. That non-super card, is falling well behind the super variants. The Gigabyte card with the bigger cooler is turning in just a little bit more performance technically, and the 7800 XT, kind of falls somewhere in between the non-super and the super cards.
So it's worth mentioning, without DLSS, the Cyberpunk numbers probably are right at the very edge of what I would consider playable at 4K.
Right, yeah. I mean, once again, Cyberpunk, even without ray tracing, is going to be an intensive game. So I think a lot of people do need to lean on some sort of upscaling feature, but it's still good to look at just the pure rasterization number. We will look at upscaling in a minute. Going back through the rest of these, I mean, we're at 4K, we're kind of seeing the same thing. I would say the 4070 non-super is just as well equipped for 4K as the super variants are. It's not like the super variants are all of a sudden just gonna blow away 4K, and it's kind of a different story there. It really comes down to the settings, the way that you're going to use the GPU, and if you want to engage, maybe a little bit of light upscaling. Speaking of upscaling, now let's look at some 4K numbers with upscaling, because the way that I think about it is that if, especially on a card of this caliber, if you're going to be turning on ray tracing features, you're probably going to want to use it with upscaling as well.
And
right?
honestly, I think on every card on the market, with the exception of maybe the 4090, at this point, if you're turning on ray tracing features and cranking them up at any level, you're probably going to do some upscaling to help smooth out those slow frames.
Yeah, and I will say I did not look at frame generation. Also, to keep things even, I tested all of these cards with FSR. So that FSR is GPU agnostic, so we can use them on all these cards. Yes, in some situations, DLSS actually performs better or looks considerably better than the FSR implementation. It really depends on the game and kind of the settings that you're doing. But because I only have so much time in the day and I wanted to keep things even, I just kept FSR for all the GPUs.
And just to be clear, FSR 2, no frame gen.
No frame gen.
And you're using the balance setting?
The balance preset, yeah. Okay. So 1440p, it's going to turn in a result of 1506 by 847.
Oh, my favorite resolution.
Oh, yes, the best resolution ever.
1506 by 847.
And then at 4K, it's turning in a resolution of 2259 by 1270. So
nice.
one of them is below 1080p. The other one is above 1080p. So I have two games that I did this on. The first one is Cyberpunk. This is the RT medium preset. So not full path tracing. It's just doing some light ray tracing.
Reflections, shadows, fancy colored lights in different places. The noteworthy thing about Cyberpunk is this is the current state of the PCR, right? So with with the ray tracing cranked up on Cyberpunk, you're looking at the best that you can do right now. It isn't really representative of what you're going to see in a console port. We'll take a look at that in a second, which is, I think, the vast majority of ray tracing games we're going to see in the next couple of years.
Exactly. And depending on how you feel about frame rates, all of these cards are actually turning in above 60 frames per second. And watching the benchmark, it actually didn't look too bad to my eyes.
Eminently playable ray tracing frame rates, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, if you're curious and you want to dabble, sure, this isn't like going to blow the doors off. But you can. It is obtainable.
Well, the nice thing about the super cards coming in at greater than 90 frames per second is it actually gives you a little more headroom if you want to turn stuff up a little bit higher, potentially.
Yeah. But when we switch over to 4K, we're getting in that territory where it's like, okay, this is probably not playable with the settings that I have picked here. At the lowest point, we've got just over 30, and the super variants are turning in just over 40.
This is the kind of perf that if I got on a Steam Deck, I'd be okay with.
Right.
When I'm on a full desktop computer with a discrete video card, I'm like, maybe I should turn stuff down a little bit.
I mean, it's doable. You know, you can do it if you want to put your bells and whistles. It's not a complete sideshow, but it's probably not the way you would want to configure it to play long gaming sessions. But it's doable, which I think is interesting. But now let's switch over to Returnal because, like you said, Cyberpunk is kind of the bleeding edge of RT on PCs. Returnal is a little bit more of an indication of the console RT experience. So not as light. You get some features here and there, but it's not like earth-shattering and GPU melting.
It's indicative of like a launch era PS5 title. It's the weird thing about ray tracing, unlike a traditional raster pipeline, is that raster pipelines are pretty comparable across the board, and your memory bandwidth and your GPU clocks are going to directly affect the performance of the game. Mm-hmm. With the ray tracing stuff, it really wildly varies based on what bits and pieces of the ray tracing features the developers chose to use their ray tracing budget for. So in Returnal, they do some reflections and some colored lights and stuff like that. It's pretty light, but like I said, I think this is a fair assumption of what you're going to see kind of across the current gen console ports to PC, which we're starting to see a lot more of these days.
Which I will say, I did run the same FSR balance preset for the upscaling, but here I use the Epic preset for the ray tracing. So this is all the ray tracing features in Returnal, cranked up and at 1440p, which is once again rendering at native 1080p. We're seeing over 100 frames per second on all of the cards. So like I would say that this is you're either going to accept this or you're actually going to tweak to maybe turn on a little bit more bells and whistles. But this is playable. This is definitely doable. Switching over to 4K, we're actually still above 60 frames per second on all these cards. So I would say when we're looking at these cards under the lens of ray trace implementations that are like console ports, then I actually do think these cards are suited for that.
They seem totally viable for playing ports from Xbox Series or PlayStation 5. Yeah.
So to wrap up, RT and upscaling, once again, there's a lot of different ways to implement it, a lot of different settings, a lot of different ways to upscale or add frame generation. But one of the things that we are also seeing in here is that the AMD card is not as well suited for ray tracing compared to Nvidia cards, and that's something we've all known.
Especially compared to the new supers, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So I mean, if you do care about bells and whistles, like Nvidia is probably the one you want to look at for ray tracing. But I mean, FSR is open to any platform, so you can use this on whatever GPU you want.
Well, and the other thing about the ray tracing perf especially is that the the variance in ray tracing implementations in games is so wide right now.
It's true.
It's hard to make kind of generalized statements from a couple of benchmarks about ray tracing, because whether you're doing like indirect reflections or whole world lighting or global illumination, dramatically changes what the performance impact is, which also changes which cards are going to do better in a way that makes this is kind of a brave new world in terms of ray tracing.
Yeah, and a good way to maybe kind of think about it is that, like you said, I actually do believe at this level these cards are capable of handling console port ray tracing implementations. But if I were to run this under the full path tracing mode, this is going to buckle. Yeah. So I think it's not ready for full path tracing stuff, but I think it'll do fine with console port kind of stuff. So, but
what about power, Adam?
Power and thermals are definitely a big consideration. And one of the stories we can see is that yes, the spec that they said jumping up from the non-super variant to the super variant, it's about 20 watts. So used a little bit more power.
About a 10% bump.
Yeah, to get there, but more performance because of it, which is nice. But unfortunately for AMD, we're seeing about almost 100 watts more for the 7800 XT.
And just to be clear, this is the test methodology here is you run F1 2022 for like 12, 15 minutes, and then look at the peak draw over that period, the spike.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
What the highest spike that it reported in MSI Afterburner during that test bench time, this is at 1440p in the F1 mode, so these are really high frame rates, really high power draws. I got this testing from Brad. This is the way that he does it as well. Okay. So, obviously, this is something that we've known, that AMD is less power efficient than Nvidia, and we're still seeing the same kind of thing here. Even though the super variant added a little bit more power draw, it's still nowhere near what the AMD card is pulling down. How that relates to thermals is different. Part of it is the power draw, but part of it is the fact that these cards are kind of clocked differently and have different cooling solutions. The flow-through design cooler on the Founders Edition is a really good design, but also this Gigabyte Aero, this is 3 fans, huge shroud.
There's a lot more cooling surface in the cooler. It's a bigger card, so there's more surface area for air to fin contact. Right?
Yeah. But surprisingly, in the testing that I did here, we're seeing about a 6C drop from the Founders Edition to the Aero. So, that is a healthy drop.
And that's the die temp measured by Afterburner and the GPU.
Exactly. Yeah. Same kind of testing. And you know what? It is actually not too far off from this Asus Dual. I think it has a bigger design, but also was using less power. I think that's why it was able to keep up a little bit better. In some ways, and in some tests, I actually feel like the Founders Edition design is maybe a little under underspec'd, because it seems like you could really get some good gains by having a more cooling.
Well, I was just gonna say, it's worth mentioning too. This Gigabyte board is slightly overclocked. So the fact that they're running a lower max die temp, despite the overclock and a little more power coming into it, pretty impressive.
Yeah. So it's variables to equate, right? Way bigger card compared to that, but you definitely do get some cooling gains from that. And either way, the super variant, it's drawing more power than this non-super variant, but actually turning in a little less cooling. So, which is nice.
So one of the things I'm excited about that you've had cooking for a minute are let's say, work benchmarks related to high-end GPUs. Do you have anything to tease?
Right.
Full video coming soon, I hope.
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of testing for creative applications on GPUs and CPUs as well. I'm gonna just share a little bit of a taste here, not get too much into the numbers, but specifically I have Premiere Pro and DaVinci Resolve numbers to show. These are just the overall numbers, and I didn't do testing on a third-party variant. I just did the the standard Founders Edition
Okay.
to kind of test here. So in Premiere Pro, the workloads that PCWorld is running through these cards, we're not seeing a huge increase between the non-super and the super variant. So, you know, I think that's one of those situations where if you're actually using these GPUs mostly to do work rather than gaming, then hey, save yourself a little bit of money, because you're probably not going to see too much of a difference stepping up to the
Cheaper,
super
quieter, cooler, better,
Depending.
maybe in this case.
Yeah.
Now, the DaVinci numbers were a little different, though.
DaVinci numbers are a little different, but it's still in the ballpark. Honestly, though, the AMD numbers have caught up slightly. I would say, you know, if you're looking at all these, the cheaper one is the 7800 XT, and it is actually turning in a better score. And I think I'm not going to go into the subscores here, but some of that is because of the increased VRAM that is on the 7800 XT. So
I was going to say, just looking at the benchmarks for the DaVinci part of PCWorld, feels like this maybe has more to do with amount of memory rather than the actual speeds of the cards.
Yeah, and I like to throw these in here because a lot of these reviews are based off of gaming. And I mean, I think a lot of people who build desktops are gaming, but a lot of people are also doing some serious workloads as well. So it's nice to look at those numbers and be like, oh, okay, well, the results from the gaming uplift does not equate necessarily to workloads, and these are just two video editing applications, right? I mean, there's you know, game developer compiling stuff that's different. You really got to look at some benchmarks and try to find some ways that people are testing it in the ways that you use a CPU or a GPU. But once again, the gains we're seeing in gaming doesn't always necessarily equate to workloads.
So what you're saying is when I try to expense the 4090 for my work machine, you're going to say no.
Actually, probably there it makes sense.
Okay.
But to wrap this up to this review, and so we can get out of here, we can kind of quickly go over the design. You know, we talked about it a little bit. A lot of it is personal preference. You know, and kind of taste. Some of it is availability, because you might really appreciate the Founders Edition design with that flow-through cooler, but it's hard to get your hands on.
I mean, I'm going to tell you, if I'm building an ITX machine, there's one of these cards I definitely want more than the other two.
True. And you know, I don't have this stacked up here, but if I were to line this up, you know, this is a little bit more in line with the smaller cards compared to this big honkin' Aero card. And also, the Aero card is in white, a nice white and silver kind of
I do like white
motif,
and silver.
right? Yeah. I mean, and for the longest time, it was actually one of the only kind of white GPUs you can get. Now there are other options from like Asus and MSI. I feel like white is definitely kind of popping off right now.
So are these all 12-volt H-Power cards?
No.
The
The Founders Edition is, this Gigabyte Aero is, but this dual is actually just one 8-pin power plug here.
Wow.
It actually does have an expanded PCB design as well, so it's kind of semi-flow through.
Oh, it doesn't. So like the Founders Edition has a cutout that kind of V's up here, aligned with this mark on the back of the card.
Exactly, yeah. And actually, the PCB design for this bigger Aero is a little bit closer to what you actually would get in the Founders here.
Stops 2/3
but
of the way up.
PCB design on the vanilla 4070 here is even taller than that. But I mean, you get a single 8-pin power, which is pretty nice. You know, and depending on what case you're putting it in and things like that, it's definitely something to consider. The Radeon card has two 8-pin power, but as we saw, I mean, it does use a little bit more power, so it kind of makes sense.
I noticed both of the Gigabyte boards have a go fast switch.
That's one way to look at it. Yeah, there's a BIOS. There's OC and silent mode. It actually a little bit more for like fan curve tuning as opposed to actual like clock speed increases. Like, oh man, I'm gonna get an extra overclock here. So actually, yeah. So the Asus card has a P and a Q. The Gigabyte card has that as well. This Challenger actually has an LED on and off light. So very simple LED implementation, and it's just a on and off switch.
If you don't like LEDs, that beats having to go and get the little pieces of black electrical tape and put them over them all. So.
And then the Founders Edition cards, I don't think they've ever had BIOS switches, right? That's always just been kind of in P mode.
Look, in the old days, we called those reference designs, because that was the one that they sent out to all the OEMs to say, hey, this is what your cards should be like. and then the OEMs went crazy from there. So.
Yeah, and all of them have different software implementations too. I didn't dive too deep in kind of the software you can get with all of them, but some of them have good features. That really comes down to personal preference, though.
Yeah.
So, depending on what you're doing. Also, unfortunately, I am a big fan of undervolting. I did not do any undervolting testing to kind of see how these land, but hopefully somebody else did out there, because I want to watch that video.
So what's the big takeaway on the 4070 Supers? Does this seem like a good upgrade, not exactly a replacement, because the 4070 is going to stay around.
It's going to stay around, but yeah, I mean, for the same price at starting at $600, I mean, you are getting, somewhere around 18 to 20% performance increase, and I think that's a win.
And real RT performance at 1440. As well.
For sure. Like out of all the super cards that got released, this is the one that had the biggest jump in just pure raster and pure oomph. Obviously, I do think it is a little constrained by the 12 gig of VRAM, pushing too far into 4K, and it's just not quite suited for RT, depending on the configuration that you wish to choose. So, I wouldn't say that these cards are future-proof and it's going to be fine. You might want to step up a little bit higher for that. But I do know a lot of people who are in this range, like the 70 range. And if they didn't get in on a 4070, I think a 4070 Super is a great jumping off point.
Seems like a good upgrade from a 3070, 2070. What about a 3080? If you're sitting on a 3080 right now, or 2080 even, is this an upgrade, or are you going to go? Do you have to go a notch higher, you think?
I mean, yes, in some ways, right?
Okay.
The pure raster, you're probably going to get slight increases there. DLSS 3.0, is only available on the 40 series and up. So
and the RT performance should be enormous in these compared to the old cards.
But really also power too. The 30 series definitely could suck down some juice. So maybe that's another reason. And heat, right? I mean, but for the most part, I think those are more of side grades.
Okay.
You really want to know that you want to get it for one of those other specific reasons. But once again, the 4070 non-super is sticking around, and I actually do think if the price continues to creep down, there are reasons to still go with the 4070 non-super. But for the most part, if you can swing it, maybe try to step up to the super variant. But yeah, any other questions?
Sounds like a really great 1440/1080p board.
Yeah. Some people would say this is where the 4070 should have come in all along. Whatever, it's here now. So yeah, I'm glad that it's an option. Thank you for sitting down and kind of going over these review numbers with me.
We should do it again a couple of times.
We will. Actually, we do have reviews of the 4070 Ti Super and the 4080 Super upcoming. And like I said, my big benchmark deep dive into creative workloads also contain these super refreshes as well. So look for that in the future. Thanks again for asking some good questions. Thanks again for watching. And if you want more of this awesome GPU coverage, please subscribe here on PCWorld. And until then, we will see you in the next one.